In the midst of all this flux, Annie and I moved to Aspen. It was Christmas 1970. Mountain promontories had always been part of the equation for us, and when the numbers for country roads kept growing, I figured we could afford our dream house. If I was going to succeed as an entertainer, that was where I wanted to enjoy the rewards. I had a long-standing commitment to perform a couple of benefit concerts for the Visiting Nurses Association in Aspen. So Annie and I drove to Aspen together, like characters out of a short story. I was turning 27, and she was maybe 25. We knew we were about to experience Dame Fortune's largesse, but we didn't know quite the extent of her generosity. We were trying to be grown-ups about it. Winter had settled in, and there was snow on the slopes. The whole setting went right into your soul. After the first benefit concert, we spent the remainder of the day looking for a house, but everything was at least twice what we could afford. That night, before the second benefit, a midnight concert, we drove to a reception in North Starwood. The night was beautiful and unearthly, with a full moon and a sky so bright you could go cross-country skiing. What I wouldn't give, I thought, to see our days unfold here. As in a fairy tale, our kindly host, sensing our dilemma the next morning, suggested that we look just at land. So far, Starwood had been only minimally developed. He brought us up to the promontory where my house now stands and told us to take a look from there. I looked out over the valley and saw that no houses had been built yet. Even before Annie came around the car to where I was standing, I knew we'd found home. We'd stumbled on it, but I'm convinced it was preordained that we'd find this place. Just the land alone cost all the money we had at the time. We rented a place in town and began to count the days. It was going to take another year before we could start to build. For 365 days, I fantasized about what living there was going to be like. The day the building contractor was to break ground, I came up from town to be on hand and found these two old codgers, Jim and Percy Pratt, standing around a little uncertainly. They were the foremen on the job, both of them 6.5 feet tall and homely as mud fences. I almost couldn't take my eyes off them. We introduced ourselves. "Well, Mr. Denver," one of them finally said, "where do you want to aim this thing?" A couple of hours later, there it was, the whole house laid out in pegs and string and pointing through the 100-year-old scrub oak to the mountains beyond. Every day that I was not on the road, I would travel up the mountain to see how much they had done, and I'd sit up there and wait for sunset. Life didn't seem so fleeting from a perspective where you could see the day unfold. Invariably, as my mind meandered, my thoughts dwelt on the nature of higher ground. Appropriately enough, the album After Poems, Prayers, and Promises was called Irie, which RCA released in February 1972. It didn't perform as well as the first album, and we slid a little on the charts. But then barely 7 months later, before I had a chance to wonder if fame was really so fleeting, RCA released Rocky Mountain High. I remember to the moment starting that song in my head. In mid-August, Annie and I and some friends went up to a lake in the high country to watch the meteor showers. Imagine a moonless night in the Rockies in the dead of summer, and you have it. I had insisted to everybody that it was going to be a glorious display. The air was kind of hazy when we started out, but by midnight it had grown clear. I had my guitar with me and a fishing rod. At some point I went off in a little raft to the middle of the lake, singing my heart out. It wasn't so much that I was singing to entertain anyone back on shore, but rather I was singing for the mountains and for the sky. Either my voice gave out or I got cold, but at any rate, I came in and found that everybody had kind of drifted off to their individual campsites to catnap. We were right below the tree line, maybe up around 10,500 feet, and we hadn't seen too much activity in the sky yet. There was a stand of trees over by the lake, and about a dozen aspens scattered around. Around midnight I had to get up to pee and stepped out into this open spot. It was dark over by those trees, darker than in the clearing. I looked over there and could see the shadow from the starlight. There was so much light from the stars in the sky that there was a noticeable difference between the clearing and everywhere else. The shadow of the starlight blew me away. I went back and lay down next to Annie in front of our tent, thinking everybody had gone to sleep, and thinking about how in nature all things large and small were interwoven, when swoosh, a meteor went smoking across the sky. And from all over the campground came the odd responses, "Did you see that?" It got bigger and bigger until the tail stretched out all the way across the sky and burned itself out. Everybody was awake, and it was raining fire in the sky. I worked on the song, and the song worked on me for a good couple of weeks. Mike Taylor, an acoustic guitarist who had performed with me at the cellar door, had moved out to Aspen. Mike sat down and showed me this guitar lick, and I was working one day with it, and suddenly the whole thing came together. It was just what the piece needed. When I realized what I had, another anthem maybe, a true expression of oneself maybe, we changed the sequencing on the album we just completed, and then we changed the album title. The first single we released from the album was Goodbye Again, the final song of a trilogy that had begun with Leaving on a Jet Plane and continued with Follow Me. The second single was Rocky Mountain High, and it became hard not to hear it being played. The radio rotation was so heavy. If my recording of Country Roads made me a star, the recording of Rocky Mountain High gave me superstar status. And the remarkable thing about it was that it was a long song. It was hard to do long songs, even in those days. Now you can't really do them at all. The music has to fit the program niche. This didn't. But we worked it, we got a response, and it flew up the charts. That summer, before the record was released, must have been the freest summer I'd ever had in my life. I wasn't working all that much. I wasn't big enough to be in the big venues. I was a college concert act, and there weren't any college concerts in the summer. Nor was I big enough to do fairs. I did a few concerts with Blood, Sweat, and Tears as their opening act, but that was it. I was home that summer. I got to feel the mountains under me. In an attempt to redeem my untested youth, all work and no play makes John a dull boy, I hung out with my friends. My friends were those I'd made the first year I'd worked in Aspen, particularly the trio of Paul Lurch, Michael Shore, and Don Straka, a wonderful guy otherwise known as Crow. They were just a bunch of guys who weren't in show business and weren't impressed with anyone who was, but they had come one night to hear me sing and loved the songs. Naturally, I got stoned with those guys. It was 1972. Exploring inner space had become as important to my generation as the exploration of outer space. I tripped out on acid for the first time with Crow. Afterward, we took our motorcycles over Red Mountain, down to Laredo, then up to this place called Periphery Peak. The line, and they say that he got crazy once and tried to touch the sun from Rocky Mountain High, came out of this. What a head trip it was. It was also in that summer that John Munchoff, a friend from Minnesota, came with his wife Lana to visit and ended up getting killed riding my motorcycle. I marked that too in Rocky Mountain High. Some people had the idea that the song was about getting stoned in the mountains, and it's true that that was going on, but the song was about how exhilarating it was to be there, to feel free, to have come to such a place, both personally and geographically, and it was a reflection on mortality. That was also the summer that Annie and I, all boxed in about communicating and getting tenser with each other by the moment, first did the S training. I wish I could recall the humor of those days, because it wasn't as grim as it might sound. Those were the early years of the human potential movement, of what Tom Wolfe called the me decade, and EST was a big part of that explosion. When Werner Erhard, the head of EST, came to town, Annie and I heard about his movement and decided pretty much simultaneously that it might help us. We went to the training sessions without preconceptions. Aspen in those days, just as now, was full of cures and therapies, and we found EST deeply affecting. For me, it helped a lot. If nothing else, I found a framework that allowed me to be a bit more articulate as a person, particularly as it involved feelings that suddenly I had a handle on, feelings that I'd only been dealing with before in the most fragile way. I liked the idea that came to me through EST that I could stay centered even when I was down. And there were those days. What a relief to sort out one's in-choate self, one's sciences. Werner became a close friend, as did others in the training. EST is about being honest, about working through to an expression of your real self. Should I come clean about my sexual infidelities and risk losing Annie? Should I bare my heavy heart? For months and months I wrestled with my angel. Sex was the last thing I could comprehend. The next was marriage. After Rocky Mountain High did as well as it did, I kept up a hectic road schedule. It seemed as if I was on the road half my time. Jerry was not only drumming up concert dates, an exhausting schedule of one-night stands coast to coast, but was pitching me to all the networks for a series of TV specials. As part of that build-up, he set up some television appearances for me. I must have been a guest on the Merv Griffin Show alone a dozen times. I went off to London for a couple of months in the spring of 1972 and did a BBC show in Shepherd's Bush Green, where there was a live audience and less pressure about succeeding than in American television. I wanted to get used to doing television before I had my own show, and BBC Two had a channel on which contemporary American music was being explored by different artists brought in to do their thing. The director, Stanley Dorfman, was really sensitive to the music. I was given a chance to do 6 weekly shows live on Sunday night. The regular crew was made up of me, Bill and Taffy Danoff, and Pan's People, a group of young, beautiful dancers whom I danced with, if you can call what I did dance. It was a small family of players, and each week there was a guest artist with whom I sang. One night we'd run 58 minutes, another night 59, another 61. It was like doing English music hall, both intensely professional and professionally laid back. About the only time I'd get to see anything of London was when we'd film a couple of segments outside some place, which gave us a chance to change sets and clothes. I can't remember doing much of anything else while I was there besides the show. They worked us pretty hard. I'll never forget flying home that time. It was the end of May, springtime in the mountains. Friends of ours were getting married. The time in England was the longest stretch that I'd spent that far away. I flew from London to Chicago and on to Denver, but I missed the last connection into Aspen, so I had to charter a plane. When I arrived, Annie was standing there waiting for me in a dress of deep violet, with the green mountains behind her. Her skin was tanned. She was a healthy-looking woman. Her eyes were shining. She had long, wavy hair. God, she looked good. That was a wondrous moment. A frame frozen in my memory, one freeze frame among the many. Annie and I had been married for quite some time, 7, 8 years. When the thought of having children first came to us during those early Rocky Mountain years, we had both been busy and involved, so we didn't press the idea. We hadn't been trying to have children, but neither had we been trying not to. I think that's when we created an opening in our lives for children. It became the focus of our lives together. Time passed, though, and nothing happened. The doctors checked me out, and apparently my body was producing only a minute amount of sperm. And of the sperm that was there, such a small amount had the mobility to swim upstream that the doctors felt it was unlikely that I could ever produce my own children. Annie and I started to weigh our feelings about adoption and decided that's what we wanted to do. We then went through the adoption process, which I remember as a time of great humility. Once we started processing the adoption papers, whenever I found a quiet moment in the day, including just before I got out of bed in the morning, I offered a prayer to this little spirit out there. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I don't know what you have to go through to get here and be with us, but we love you very much and can't wait to be with you. With all of those anticipations streaming through me, we came to New York City. I had 4 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden, and we were staying at the Sherry Netherland Hotel. It was May 12, 1974, and that night I dreamed that 3 people in white robes came and gave me a little boy. We hadn't specified either sex in our communication with the adoption agency. All we wanted was that the baby be healthy enough to live with us in the mountains. We were active people. We liked to be outside, and we wanted that for our baby as well. But in my dream, when the baby was put into my arms, I noticed that it was a boy, a dark-faced boy with round eyes and a little bit of an overbite. And as I was holding him, he looked up, grabbed my thumb, and smiled. In the morning, I recounted that dream to Annie. 11 days later, Zach was born. We didn't see him then, but we were notified about his birth, and when he was about 2 months old, we went up to Minnesota to the adoption agency to pick him up. I remember hearing Annie's song on the radio as we were driving there. It had become the #1 song in the country that week, which struck me as an interesting coincidence. On this hot day in August, the #1 song in the country is a song Dad wrote for Mom. Anyway, we arrived at the agency. Zach was being flown up from the south. We had just been told that the young woman who was bringing Zach had been delayed, and were trying to keep from feeling disappointed when the door at the far end of the hall opened and the woman appeared after all with our child. Without a word, she came running down the hall and handed the baby to me. He had round eyes and this little bit of an overbite, and when I held him he smiled and grabbed my thumb. Zach was the child in my dream, exactly the same child. I recognized his face, and I think he recognized mine. At least he looked at me in the most knowing way. And right there, dream and reality came together for me. In fact, dream and reality became entwined almost as a matter of course during this period. Jerry, as I mentioned earlier, got me on the Bob Hope Show, which made my face and my work familiar to millions. Next, he secured ABC's backing for a series of John Denver television specials, and beat the death out of ABC to get them to promote the show. At the same time, he got RCA to release a greatest hits album of my work, and the promoting all dovetailed. We all saw Jerry do that, but how he did it was uncanny. The way he planned all of these things and took the time to set them up and to create the audience was Jerry at his best. The album sold 10 million copies, which at the time only a couple of other albums had matched. Then we were looking at movies, and I became part of Jerry's first Hollywood project, a comedy called Oh God. It was a script that had been knocking around Hollywood for 5 years or so, with a part that I might have been born to play. Jerry insisted we split the proceeds 50-50. At the time, the film turned out to be one of Hollywood's top grossers. My percentage of the profits, which I was given in lieu of salary, must have netted me more than $1 million. Looking for space. If I said I didn't yearn for immortality, I would be lying. That desire to be a hero was ingrained. It was woven into everything I tried to do. However much I kept it down, it grew with me. When I set out at 20, a career of heroic proportions danced before my eyes. But the fact is, I had a skewed view of what was really heroic. Most of what I desired would have been served just by having creative work to do. In the recording studio, I always felt like I just showed up and these other guys did all the complicated stuff. I just played guitar and sang. Here I was then, still in the golden spring of life, still ripening, and already, with country roads and Rocky Mountain High, I had a career that promised to be larger than life. The possibilities had Jerry working double time. Was I ready for this, or was I headed for self-destruction? What was this going to cost me? Could I possibly keep my end up? How, under these circumstances, could I stay balanced? Dad's advice to see myself as no better than anyone else wasn't going to help. I needed a coach. Werner Erhard was an ideal guide on the journey out of the metaphysical woods of my parents' generation. I would find other guides as life went on, but Werner would always remain one of them. He was accused of being a huckster and has been tarred with the same brush that some critics apply belittlingly to New Age thinking in general. But I always found that what he had to say had particular meaning for me. Do you live at the effect of what's going on in your life, Werner would ask, or do you take responsibility for what's going on? When I heard that in 1971, I acted on it, not in all the areas of my life, but in those where I had let myself be a victim. Werner was a guide without intellectual conceits, which was of real importance to me. Around intellectual conceits, I'd go dumb. I was too timid to express myself, too shy to say what I thought needed saying. With the exception of my experience with the Mitchell Trio, I had little opportunity in the dozen years that I'd worked as an entertainer to stretch out as a thinking person. When you're a superstar, the road rewards you for exposing your vulnerability, not for the paths your thoughts take. Though I didn't feel exactly prepared to come forward as a participant in public debate on the larger subjects in life, the fact is it's something I wanted to do. My dilemma registered with me, especially after my celebrity took off. The first time I appeared as a guest host of The Tonight Show, I must have said far out 50 times if I said it once. Being cute on stage was my way of covering up a fear I had of being seen as vacuous. Every time one of my guests would say something interesting, I would say, far out. without even thinking. It was like having a nervous tic. In fact, for a lot of people, that's when far out came into the vernacular. I have a feeling it will be in my obituary, that and the phrase Rocky Mountain High. My frustration, up until that point, had always been that Dad hadn't known how to open up the world over there and bring me into it with his perspective and say what it was he wanted me to get out of life. I had always been trying to learn from him, but he hadn't readily shared his thoughts, and I'd been left wandering in a mental thicket. Werner's sensitivity training helped me begin to disengage from all that. He helped me outgrow what I should have outgrown long before. I'd never heard anyone articulate how the mind and memory work to keep your life ensnared, and how ultimately you have to be responsible for changing the situation yourself. It wasn't that I bought everything Est was about, but rather that Est, in the form of the dialogues that Werner orchestrated, gave me the incentive and the opportunities to elaborate on my thoughts and to take responsibility for them. On the heels of the success of Country Roads, I went out to Boise, Idaho, with an ABC film crew that was making a documentary about birds of prey. The film's producer, Robert Rieger, was a fan of my music and had asked me to write a song for the soundtrack. Not only did I consider this a good use for my music, but it gave me the chance to learn about these birds from one of the world's great ornithologists, Morley Nelson. I had more than a casual interest in the subject. I'm fascinated by the fact that eagles have been a symbol of every civilization in the history of man. So I went on location with the crew. Eagles have an opaque, nictating membrane, which is like an inner eyelid that they can use to protect their vision when they come diving out of the sky at high speeds. It lowers and lifts when you least expect it. Poised there, with the eagle on my arm, I was imagining myself in eagle-like flight, when the nictating membrane suddenly lifted and the eagle caught me in its gaze. For an instant, I thought that this was it. Goodbye, Mama. Held there in that gaze, I almost stopped breathing. 20 seconds was about all the time the eagle needed to dispose of its interest in me. A humbling experience. But for me, that look stuck. That look and the power in it lodged itself in my heart. For an incredible 20 seconds, I had the feeling of connection as if we were seeing into each other's spirit. The eagle sparked my idealism. This is the way I'd stay grounded, by being in nature and teaching about it. The next year, I went up to the Canadian Rockies to work on another of Rieger's projects and met Tommy Tompkins, whose life took hold of my imagination in yet another way that exercised a big influence on how I wanted to define my space. Tommy was a former Northwest Mountie who for 9 months had lived in the wilderness alongside a pack of wolves. A film he had made about it had been shown on Canadian television, and Rieger had gotten a hold of him to do a show on bighorn sheep. He wanted me to write the music for it and to serve as celebrity host. Apparently, I'd done so well in Boise, I'd get to play myself. I saw this assignment as kind of a gift, one I gladly accepted. The question the show posed, how does one live in nature without upsetting its balance, is one that I haven't stopped asking for the past 2 decades. Annie came for the last part of that trip, and we got to spend some time together in the woods west of Calgary. It was sort of a fairy tale time, the end of summer, and I can't remember there being many times after that when the two of us came together in harmony, unburdened by the fact that we weren't dealing with our contradictions. It was a fabulous drive home through rolling hills, and there was even a double rainbow in the sky above us at one point. I remember thinking that if we were true Druids, we could go at life more slowly, enjoy this more, enjoy each other. But Starwood beckoned, and beyond Starwood the audiences beckoned, and we kept going. I tucked the experiences with Morley and Tommy and of making documentary statements under my belt.